Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Welcome back. So today we are taking you on another deep dive, and our core mission for this one is exploring how our 18th century Constitution is just violently colliding with the realities of the 21st century.
Yeah, colliding is definitely the right word for it.
Right, because we've got a really interesting stack of sources for this deep dive. We're looking at an article analyzing a Supreme Court case on Geofence warrants, and then we have excerpts from Supreme Court oral arguments about the FCC's ability to issue these just massive fines.
Which I know to a lot of people probably sounds like a bunch of dry procedural legal stuff.
Oh, totally. It sounds like a textbook.
Right. But it's actually not. At the core, these topics are about the fundamental limits of government power over your life, your data, and your money.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this because I want to start with this gripping story from the source material. We're going back to May 2019 in Midlothian, Virginia.
Okay.
So this guy, Okello Shatry, walks into the Call Federal Credit Union and robs it. He makes off with like $195,000.
Which is a huge haul for a bank robbery.
A massive haul. And the crazy part is he gets away completely clean. I mean, he totally eludes the police, and the investigation basically just hits a brick wall.
Right. Completely stalls out.
Yeah. So, with no other options, the police decide to use a geofence warrant, and the payoff here is just incredibly dramatic.
It really is.
Because they serve this warrant, and later on, they search his home based on that data, and they find nearly $100,000 in cash.
Wow.
And not just loose bills either. The cash is still wrapped in the paper bands that were actually signed by the very bank teller he robbed.
I mean, you can't ask for better physical evidence than that.
No, you really can't. And it led to a nearly 12-year prison sentence. But we have to look at how a geofence warrant actually works compared to a traditional one.
Yeah, the mechanics are totally different.
Right, because normally if police want a warrant, it's like fishing with a spear. You know exactly which fish you're aiming at, right? But a geofence warrant, it's like throwing a massive digital dragnet into the ocean just to see what you pull up.
That's a really good analogy. And what's fascinating here is how this completely reverses traditional police work.
How so?
Well, historically, you start with a suspect,
Yeah.
right? And then you use a warrant to get their specific location or their property. But with a geofence, you start with a location to find a suspect. You don't know who you're looking for.
Which is wild when you really think about it.
It is. And that brings us right to the Fourth Amendment collision. Because the Fourth Amendment is all about banning unreasonable searches. And our sources outline two starkly contrasting viewpoints on this without taking a side, obviously.
Right, so let's walk through those sides. What's the argument from law enforcement?
So law enforcement argues that geofences are an absolutely crucial tool today. I mean, they point out that these warrants cracked the January 6th Capitol riot.
Oh, right, they used them for that.
Yeah, and they used them to identify the suspect who planted the pipe bombs. Plus, they've solved cold cases and killings in California, Georgia, North Carolina. They basically argue that without this, a lot of modern crimes just go entirely unsolved.
Okay, so that makes practical sense, but then you have the civil libertarian side.
Exactly. And their argument is that these are pure fishing expeditions.
Because they search innocent bystanders.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You're sweeping up the private records of people whose only crime was walking their dog near a bank. They argue that allowing this could just unleash a massive wave of these reverse searches.
Okay, but wait, I want to push back on that privacy argument for a second based on a detail from the source.
Okay, go ahead.
Because the prosecutors pointed out that Shatry voluntarily opted into Google's location history. He turned it on. So if you willingly hand over your location to a massive corporation, haven't you kind of surrendered your expectation of privacy?
Oh, okay, so you're hitting on a really huge debate.
Yeah.
To answer that, we have to look at the Supreme Court's 2018 ruling that was mentioned in the text.
The one about the cell tower data.
Yes, exactly. It was a really tight 5-4 split. And Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion. And he specifically noted the extraordinary computing power of modern phones.
Right, they aren't just like old landlines anymore.
No, not at all. He called it a seismic shift in digital technology. Because the old rule was that sharing info with a third party eliminates your privacy. But Roberts challenged that, basically saying these devices create an exhaustive chronicle of your life.
So it's not really voluntary if you need a phone to just function in modern society.
Exactly. And because of this tension, the lower courts are in absolute legal chaos right now.
I mean, the source highlights a major split, right?
Huge split. You have the Richmond Appeals Court, which actually upheld Chattrie's conviction.
Even though the judge thought rights were violated?
Yeah. They said the officer acted in good faith. But then you look at the New Orleans Appeals Court, and they went the total opposite direction.
What did they say?
They boldly declared that geofence warrants are general warrants categorically prohibited by the Fourth Amendment.
Categorically prohibited. Wow.
Yeah, they didn't mince words. So you have a totally fractured legal landscape right now.
Right. So the geofence case is about the government bypassing the traditional step of naming a suspect. But our next source shows the government allegedly bypassing another major traditional step, which is the jury trial.
Yes, shifting gears to the administrative state.
Exactly. We have these excerpts from the Supreme Court oral arguments about the FCC's forfeiture process. And the core question here is, can an administrative agency impose monetary penalties without a jury trial?
Which brings us right to the Seventh Amendment.
Right, the right to a jury trial for civil suits at common law. So how are both sides arguing this one?
Well, looking at it impartially, on one side you have the petitioner, which is AT&T in this case, and they claim the FCC is adjudicating a claim at law and issuing these massive fines entirely without a jury.
Which they say departs from historical understanding.
Right, and they specifically point to the recent SEC v. Jarkissi decision to back that up, basically saying you can't just bypass the courts.
Okay, so what is the government's argument then? How do they justify it?
The government's argument is super technical. They say that these FCC orders are just non-binding charging documents.
Wait, really? Non-binding?
Yeah, that's their claim. They argue that receiving the order doesn't actually create a final legal obligation to pay the fine.
So when does it become an obligation?
Only if the government actually goes to federal court for what they call a de novo collection action.
The de novo action.
Yeah, meaning starting from scratch. And the government points out that in that federal court case, a jury would absolutely be available. So they argue your rights are totally protected.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me. Let me try an analogy here to push back on that logic.
Let's hear it.
So the government is basically saying the FCC is like a bouncer writing you a ticket on a napkin. Like, it looks scary, but it's not a real legal ticket until the actual police take you to court.
That's essentially their argument, yeah.
Realistically, if you receive a massive official fine from a huge federal agency, doesn't that feel pretty binding to the person getting it?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, most people or businesses are just going to panic and pay it or settle, right? They aren't going to wait years for the DOJ to sue them in federal court.
And that's exactly the friction AT&T's lawyers brought up. The sheer threat of the penalty force's compliance, completely outside of the jury system.
It just feels like such a heavy-handed workaround.
Well, and it all comes down to scale, right? When we bring both of these cases together, the geofences and the FCC fines, the ultimate takeaway is really profound.
How so?
Think about the founders in 1791. They could never have imagined anything like Google location histories.
No, of course not.
Or massive administrative agencies like the FCC regulating invisible airwaves. Yet today, the Supreme Court is tasked with stretching those original constitutional frameworks, the Fourth and Seventh Amendments, to somehow fit these modern behemoths.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I think it really highlights that these aren't just abstract arguments happening in a vacuum.
Not at all.
Whether it's your cell phone silently tracking your morning commute or an agency regulating the businesses you use, these arguments dictate the invisible boundaries of your personal freedom and privacy every single day.
Yeah. And I'd leave you with a final thought to mull over. We know our technological capabilities and our administrative agencies are only going to continue to grow exponentially over the next 50 years, right?
Without a doubt.
So will our 18th century Constitution eventually just be stretched to its absolute breaking point? Or will these very tensions force us to completely reimagine what privacy and due process actually look like in a purely digital world?
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.